Dear friends, English literature, romantic poetry, selected poems of Percy B. Shelley, Adonis, short questions with answers. Short questions 11 to 20. Question 11. Why does Urania mildly rebuke Keats? Answer. Keats died at the age of 26. Shelley weeps for his death and calls on Urania to mourn for Keats. Shelley blames Keats' death on literary criticism that was recently published. Both the Quarterly and the Blackwoods attacked Keats because they believed him to belong to the Cockney school. So Urania mildly rebukes Keats for venturing so early into the den of the hungry dragon, the critics, by taking to a poetic career. She blames him for leaving the accepted traditions of poetry to write something fresh and original. As he was young in age, he did not achieve maturity to defend himself. She thinks that Keats should have waited for the maturity before releasing his work to the public. Basically, she feels that Keats should have matured a little so that he could have handled criticism better. If he had waited, he would have made these critics flee like deer from him. Thus, accepted traditions of poetry are compared to the trodden paths of man, and the critics are called the dragon. Question 12. How did Byron silence the Scotch reviewers? Answer. Byron was a revolutionary poet. He is quite different from Keats. He was defenseless against the critics, as he didn't have wisdom to act as a shield or scorn to return their criticism. But Byron was not so weak and timid as Keats was. Once the critic of the Edinburgh Review severely criticized Byron's first volume of poems, Hours of Idleness. It was written when he was 19 and it contained a bundle of crude, meritless lines. But Byron silenced the critics forever, writing a satiric poem, English Birds and Scotch Reviewers. The critics did not venture to attack him for the second time. Instead, they warmly praised his next volume, Childe Harold, and acknowledged him as a leading poet of the time. Here, Shelley metaphorically compares Byron to Apollo, the sun god who killed the monstrous serpent Python with an arrow. Just as Apollo silenced the python with an arrow, Byron silenced the Scotch reviewers with a single satiric poem. Thus, Byron silenced the Scotch reviewers by scolding them severely in his poem. Question 13. How does Byron mourn the death of Keats? Answer. In the poem, Urania laments the premature death of Keats. When she ends her mourning, the contemporary living poets comes to lament the death of their name of the brother poet in the guise of shepherds, wearing the customary garlands of flowers and long cloaks. The first among them was Byron, who earned poetic fame early in his life. He wrote the first volume of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage when he was only 23. It records his journey in the spirit over famous in Europe. It established his fame as a great poet during his time. His fame is compared to a vast monument, but he is greatly moved by the death of Keats. Keats' death has great impact on his poetry. Because of the death of Keats, the characteristic passionate energy and vehemence of his poetry is suppressed by the dulling effect of grief on his mind. He mourns the death of Keats, singing a quiet, pathetic song which is appropriate to the occasion. Thus, Byron cannot remain unmoved by the death of Keats. He laments his death through a mournful song. Question 14. Why does Shelley compare himself to Actaeon? Answer. Actaeon in Greek mythology was a Boeotian hero and hunter. He accidentally saw Diana's chaste goddess of the hunt naked body while she was bathing on Mount Cithaeron. It angered the goddess, and she changed him into a stag and robbed of his ability to speak, so that he could not tell any mortal that he had seen Diana's naked body. Actaeon thereafter fled in fear and then was killed by his own hounds, failing to recognize their master. Shelley compares himself to Actaeon because just as Actaeon had seen the naked beauty of Diana, Shelley has seen the naked loveliness of nature. By the naked loveliness of nature, he means the purest beauty of nature and the mysterious secrets of nature. The person who perceives these truths, his soul is filled with great thoughts which he cannot control or bear. Just as Actaeon fled in fear after being changed into a stag, Shelley ran away in confusion from vision after perceiving the naked loveliness, great truths of nature. Just as Actaeon was torn to pieces by his own hounds, Shelley was torn by his own thoughts. Just as Actaeon's hounds could not recognize him, Shelley's countrymen could not recognize his genius. So he compares himself to Actaeon. Question 15. What do you know about fate of Shelley as reflected in Adonais? Answer. In Adonais, Shelley speaks of his fate that he has been misjudged by society. In the poem, he compares his fate to that of Cain and Christ. Cain is a character from the Old Testament who committed the first murder by killing his brother Abel. On Cain, God pronounced the curse that the earth would not produce for him and he would be a fugitive and wanderer on the earth. Shelley's fate was also like that of Cain because after publishing The Necessity of Atheism, he was expelled from Oxford University. His grandfather also disinherited him for his first love for a distressed girl. His first wife's suicide was also attributed to his passion for Miss Godwin. Thus, like Cain, Shelley was treated as an outcast. Shelley also compares his fate to that of Christ. He says that his forehead is bleeding like that of Christ when he suffered the agony of the thorny crown just before crucifixion. Christ sacrificed his life for the sake of humanity, to make the world better and purer. Just like Christ, Shelley was a lover of humanity and tried his best to teach man a better order of society. So he regrets that he has been misjudged by the society. Question 16. Describe the procession of mourners in Adonais. Answer. There is often a procession of mourners in a pastoral elegy in Adonais. Urania is the first in the procession. At the time, she is surrounded by sorrow and fear. She is grief-stricken and afraid of her lonely life because of the death of her dearest son. Urania is compared to a misty, windy night in autumn. She passed like a gloomy autumnal night. She attacks the Tory reviewers and laments that she is immortal and she cannot join Keats in death. The human mourners, Byron, Thomas More, Shelley himself, and Keats' friend Leigh Hunt, follow Urania. Byron is greatly moved by the death of Keats. Keats' death has great impact on his poetry. Because of the death of Keats, the characteristic passionate energy and vehemence of his poetry is suppressed by the dueling effect of grief on his mind. He mourns the death of Keats, singing a quite pathetic song which is appropriate to the occasion. More of Ireland sings the wrongs done to Urania. His love for Keats makes poetry fall like music from his tongue. Shelley seems to be completely broken in his spirit. Leigh Hunt is in deep sorrow because of the death of Keats. Question 17. How does Shelley denounce the critic who was responsible for the death of Keats? Answer. Shelley believes that Keats died on occasion of the anonymous critic who criticizes Keats' Endymion in the Quarterly. The poet cannot bear such a premature death, so he moves from mourning to anger and calls him a viperous murderer. He also calls the critic the nameless worm because he would not put his name on the criticism. Shelley then condemns the critic to live a long life so that the critic can live on his disgraceful life. He wants the critic to live with what he has done, even if nobody else knows about it. He says the critic's infamy is not his fame, meaning that he is not famous for his criticism. The point means that the critic cannot buy fame by notoriety or sharp criticism. The critic is just a noteless a remembered name. In other words, the critic is just a stain unworthy of comment on famous name anonymous and nameless, whereas Keats is famous remembered name. The critic is infamous. Question 18. What is Shelley's concept of afterlife? Answer. Shelley metaphorically describes his concept of afterlife in Adonais. He says that no material object of the earth is completely destroyed. It transforms itself and exists at all times in different forms. By the law of nature, the dead body is transformed into fertilizing power which serves to feed the plants on which bloom sweet-smelling flowers. Thus, soul-smelling corrupt matter turns into beautiful pregnant flowers by the mysterious spirit of animation. Shelley says that no matter dies, but then asks through a rhetorical question, what happens to the soul? He compares the soul to a sword and body to a scabbard. If the soul is destroyed and the body exists in different forms, then the case would be as strange as if the sword would burn to ashes by the lighting, leaving the scabbard uninjured. Apparently, it seems that the human soul flashes only for a moment by the lightning of death, and then it is lost in the dark oblivion of death. Hence, Shelley does not believe that the soul is destroyed after death. He believes that after death, one's soul is merged into eternal soul, which is full of living energy. Human soul comes out this energy, and after the death of the body, it goes back. Thus, he looks upon soul as deathless. Question 19. How does Shelley's tone shift throughout the poem Adonais? Answer. As we go through the poem, we find that Shelley's tone shifts throughout the poem. The poem begins with a feeling of grief and pity, which is appropriate to an elegy. Shelley weeps for Keats, who is dead and who will be long mourned. He calls on Urania to mourn for Keats, who died in Rome. Besides Shelley and Urania, the abstract qualities of poetic mind mourn the death of Keats are desires, adorations, winged persuasions, destinies, splendors, glooms, incarnations, fantasies, sorrow, sighs, and pleasures. Different objects of nature also mourn the premature death of Keats. The mood of grief and pity then is replaced by hatred and anger, as the poet here calls down the curse of Cain on him who caused Keats' death. Then Shelley arouses in us the feeling of hope, as he says that there is no need to weep for Keats because Keats has passed from mortality to immortality. He tells the mourners that Keats is not dead but is made a portion of the eternal spirit. According to him, life on earth is like a sleep from which one wakes at death to live an eternal life. After his death, his body will be reduced to dust in the grave, but his soul, which is free from all impurity of matter, will be merged into the eternal soul, which is full of living energy. His soul, being a portion of the eternal spirit, will shine forever through all changes of time. Thus, the mood of the poem begins in dejection but ends in optimism, hoping Keats' spark of brilliance reverberates through the generations of future poets and inspires revolutionary change throughout Europe. Question 20. Comment on the ending of the poem Adonais. Answer. Adonais ends philosophically. Shelley concedes the passing of his friend because he accepts the idea that Keats' light will continue to kindle the inspiration of the universe. So long as we never forget the power of Adonis' spiritual resurrection, he will forever remain the poet's breath in the light that shall guide Shelley throughout the rest of his life. Shelley feels that the light of the one which is light, beauty, benediction, and love, now universal spirit, shines on his soul and dispels the gloom of his mortal nature. He imagines that his soul has begun its journey through the infinitive space and is leaving the material world and its man behind. As the universal spirit descends on him, it makes his spirit leave the world. Basically, he is imagining being dead and having his soul carried up into the heaven. He feels carried mysteriously afar. As he is carried away, he sees the soul of Keats burning like a bright star in that dwelling where those who will have forever, who will live forever, are which divides the earth and the regions of the immortals. His soul is shining like a beacon, which serves as a signal light for the poet. He imagines when he arrives, he will be with Keats and the other eternal souls. Thus, the poem ends with the imagery of the poet being reunited with